Turn with me to 2 Timothy. We are in a sermon series entitled Running Well, Finishing Well. At the very end of all of this, just keep in mind there is going to be a time of testimony and thanks. So just store away some of those thoughts. If something comes to your mind, you can just write it in your note sheets, and then when we pass the microphone, you'll have those ready. Well, last week, we looked at Paul's instruction to Timothy to avoid such men. And we saw that word avoid, it actually means to turn oneself away from, to deflect. Basically, we should not regularly associate with the types of individuals who have those 20 characteristics that we looked at, that Paul mentions in that passage. And he also gives us this warning that as we get closer to the end of all things, the end of time here on earth, those qualities, those types of people will be more increasing. You will see more of this increasing visibleness of all of this as the time goes on. Last week, we looked at 2 Timothy 3, 1 through 5. And I want to read this because today's passage, it really kind of flows right off of last week. So here's what it says in 2 Timothy 3, 1 through 5. But realize this, that in the last days difficult times will come. For men will be lovers of self, lovers of money, boastful, arrogant, revilers, disobedient to parents, ungrateful, unholy, unloving, irreconcilable, malicious gossips, without self-control, brutal, haters of good, treacherous, reckless, conceited, lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God, holding to a form of godliness, although they have denied its power. Avoid such men as these. And last week we broke these 20 categories, these 20 characteristics, up into 6 different sections. We had the first one, which was the me's. Okay, it was all about us. It was these self-centered, these self-focused, these self-reliant, these self-absorbed individuals. It was all about self. And then the next one, it was this more. Basically, there's this idea that there is this insatiable thirst inside each and every one of us. And this insatiable thirst, if it's not quenched by God, we're going to be continually seeking worldly pleasures and worldly things to try to fill that void that only God can fill. The third one was the wounding wordsters. Now, from the overflow of the heart, the mouth speaks. And these are the slanderous, these false accusers, which is actually the word devil. And they can destroy a reputation. Just by associating with these types of people, the word will get out. And they can hurt your reputation, they can hurt your testimony if you're not careful. Then we got to number 4. The actions speak louder than words. There are people that, using their actions, just the way that they live their life, we should be avoiding them. And this is where the rubber meets the road. The real danger is, by associating, by regularly connecting with people, you often take on that person's traits. And if these are the traits that they are talking about, these are things that a believer should not have anything to do a part of. Again, we need to be grounded on the truth. And in being grounded, it should keep us guarded from these types of people. Number 5, it is the truce-breaking traitors. It is untrustworthy people who are basically willing to sell you out in a heartbeat if it's going to advance them for something. And it can cause not just catastrophic problems for yourself, but it can have this rippling effect to your family and your friends and those that you love. And then the last one is the whitewashed tombs. They are hypocritical. They are people that have really no regard for God. Whether it is done in secret or it's done just blatantly. That's really where they're at. And today, we're going to conclude this kind of section of Paul's letter. And we're going to use this example that Paul gives about this type of person to avoid. So in the next few verses 6 through 9 in 2 Timothy chapter 3, this is what it says in today's passage. For among them are those who enter into households and captivate weak women weighed down with sins, led on by various impulses, always learning and never able to come to the knowledge of the truth. Just as Jannes and Jambres opposed Moses, so these men also oppose the truth, men of depraved mind, rejected in regard to the faith. But they will not make further progress, for their folly will be obvious to all, just as Jannes' and Jambres' folly was also. Now, Jannes and Jambres, okay, this is what you see from this passage. They opposed Moses. They opposed the truth. And they rejected the faith. Today, we're going to look a little deeper at this example that Paul gives about these two particular, Jannes and Jambres type people. But today, we've entitled our message, Jannes and Jambres. Let's pray. Dear Lord, I come before you. Lord, we all need to be guarded. We all need to be protected. And Lord, we need to take warnings seriously. And so God, I pray today as we look at this, that you would direct our minds, that you would help us. Lord, there's a lot here to chew on. There's a lot to take away from this. And so I thank you for Paul writing this to Timothy, and ultimately I thank you for us having it in front of us today. Lord, it's your word, and we can take it, and we can use it. And so God, guide our minds and our hearts today as we open up your word. And we praise in your precious name. Amen. The first two verses in this passage, 2 Timothy 3, 6 through 7, it says, For among them are those who enter into households and captivate weak women weighed down with sins, led on by various impulses, always learning and never able to come to the knowledge of the truth. Now, right off the bat, there's this phrase that you see. It's enter into households. Now, the original Greek that is used here, it actually means to slink into, or to creep into a house or a home. It is one thing to have all the evils of this present world that is out there. It is something entirely different to have all those things that are out there now in your home. I really like how Randy Alcorn, what he says about the access to temptations that we have in today's society. This is what he says. Our temptations aren't worse than those in first century Corinth. But televisions, computers, and even cell phones bring into our homes what used to be found only in back alleys. In our technological Corinth, temptations are only a keypad or mouse click away. I want to tell you that is a very telling quote. And I think that it pretty much summarizes a lot of things. In Corinth, they had all of the temptations that we have today, but it wasn't as maybe easily accessible or as privately accessible as some of the stuff that we have in front of us. We have a very real danger. And it's oftentimes, it is invited right into our homes. And it's sometimes done on a daily basis. And it's done in ways that are subtle. And it's this kind of creeping, sneaky type way that it comes on in. Can I just give you a word of caution over that? Be choosy of your entertainment. Whatever it is, I'm not going to go into grave detail. You know what you watch. You know what you put before your eyes, in your ears. Be careful. Be very choosy. Because it's a very real, very, very dangerous thing sometimes. So, now to give you back into what historically, what is the context of this happening, as Paul is writing this to Timothy. What's happening at this time is there are certain men who were preying on what would be gullible women, particularly. These men, they were actually taking advantage of women. And about 60 years later, Okay, Irenaeus, who is kind of an early church person, he writes about a very similar topic that Paul experienced and he was kind of writing to Timothy about. And it's only 60 years removed, but it's basically the same exact thing that is happening in Timothy's day. Here's what Irenaeus says. There was a certain heretic called Marcus who dealt in magic. He devotes himself especially to women, and those such as are well-bred and elegantly attired, and of great wealth. He tells such women that by his spells and incantations, he can enable them to prophesy. The woman protests that she has never done so and cannot do so. He says, open thy mouth, speak whatever occurs to thee, and thou shalt prophesy. The woman, thrilled to the heart, does so, and is deluded into thinking that she can prophesy. She then makes the effort to reward Marcus, not only by the gifts of her possessions, in which way he has collected a very large fortune, but also by yielding up to him her person, desiring in every way to be united to him, that she may become altogether one with him. So here's what's basically happening in this story that Irenaeus tells. There is this heretic who is this predator, and he is a very dangerous person. He is this me type person who is combined with this more type person. And he's really trying to think about, what can I get out of this lady, out of this situation? And sadly, this gullible woman, she ends up being just collateral damage along the way. And so in this time that Paul is writing to Timothy about, there are these men who are studying hard at their craft to brilliantly market themselves and to be able to kind of showcase their knowledge. Yet they've never really obtained what is true knowledge. To put themselves and all the time and the effort and the energy into something, and that the world would maybe look at them and be like, well, that's an expert. Someone who is so knowledgeable over something, yet really knows nothing about the truth. That's really a sad statement. And I think sometimes we can get lulled into the way that somebody showcases themselves, the way that they kind of put forth their intellect, and we can kind of miss that it's just empty, vain babblings. These men, at this time, they were exploiting women during Timothy's time. That's what they were doing. That was the whole purpose behind it. And then he goes on in verses 8 and 9. And he says, just as Jannes and Jambres opposed Moses, so these men also oppose the truth. Men of depraved mind, rejected in regard to the faith. But they will not make further progress, for their folly will be obvious to all, just as Jannes and Jambres' folly was also. So, the question that probably goes through your mind is, who is Jannes and Jambres? This is the only reference in all the Bible where these names appear. This is it. And so, that tells us a little something. The answer to the who is a whole lot less important to why. Okay? If God was really interested in us knowing the exact details of who, then he would give us more context to it. But this is it. And so, the real thing is, why is this here? Now, for those of you who are kind of, you got this thirst to try to know who they are, I'm going to give you two suggestions of who Jannes and Jambres may have been. But then I'm going to focus back in on why. Why is Paul writing this to Timothy in the first place? So, here it is. The first suggestion that is out there, one of the main things is there is a long-standing Jewish tradition that connects Jannes and Jambres as two of the magicians from the 10 plagues of Egypt. So if you remember back at the time where Moses goes to Pharaoh and he says, "Let my people go." That whole phrase, that whole concept, it was during this time that Pharaoh would then send out some of these magicians and these astrologers and other people, and they were trying to duplicate some of this. But God used Aaron and Moses to kind of perform these 10 plagues, to enact them on these people, to really compel Pharaoh to release the Israelites. And Pharaoh, it actually says that his heart was hardened. He hardened himself to this. He sends out his magicians, and they try to debunk these signs of God. I just want to say, before we kind of look at some of these this morning, it's really interesting, after plague number 2, it's really interesting that the magicians, it dawns on them that this is really a clear sign from God himself. And they go to Pharaoh and they protest this to him, and Pharaoh is still just absolutely hard-hearted. So here's some excerpts. This whole passage happens in Exodus 7 through 10, but starting even before the plagues, you see the magicians kind of pop up. But Aaron and his staff, and how he throws it down and becomes a serpent. Here's what it says about that. In Exodus 7, 10b into 12. Aaron threw his staff down before Pharaoh and his servants, and it became a serpent. Then Pharaoh also called for the wise men and the sorcerers, and they also, the magicians of Egypt, did the same with their secret arts. For each one threw down his staff, and they turned into serpents. And I love this part. But Aaron's staff swallowed up their staffs. It goes on, and then you see the first plague, the water turning into blood. And just a little bit later, starting in verse 20, part B, it says, "And he," speaking of Aaron, "lifted up the staff and struck the water that was in the Nile. In the sight of Pharaoh and in the sight of his servants, and all the water that was in the Nile was turned to blood. The fish that were in the Nile died, and the Nile became foul, so that the Egyptians could not drink water from the Nile. And the blood was through all the land of Egypt. But the magicians of Egypt did the same with their secret arts." They tried to make this counterfeit version of what God did. Then you get the next plague, these frogs that are everywhere. In chapter 8, 6, and 7, this is what it says. "So Aaron stretched out his hand over the waters of Egypt, and the frogs came up and covered the land of Egypt. The magicians did the same with their secret arts, making frogs come up on the land of Egypt." And then it gets into this really interesting part, where the magicians just can't duplicate any of the other plagues. You see it in verses 18 and 19 of chapter 8. "The magicians tried with their secret arts to bring forth gnats, but they could not. So there were gnats on men and beasts. Then the magicians said to Pharaoh, 'This is the finger of God.' But Pharaoh's heart was hardened, and he did not listen to them, as the Lord had said." In verse 11 of chapter 9, it goes on, he says, the magicians could not stand before Moses because of the boils, for the boils were on the magicians as well as on all the Egyptians. That's the last thing that's mentioned about these magicians. But some people, they really believe that at least 2 of those magicians are Jannes and Jambres. People who opposed Moses, people who opposed the truth and rejected the faith. It's plausible. Another suggestion. Some believe that Jannes and Jambres, they were 2 of the people who kind of goaded people into the golden calf incident. Moses, at this time, Moses is up with God receiving the 10 Commandments. And while Moses is away, I want you to listen to what is happening down below. This is in Exodus chapter 32, just some excerpts from there. Now, when the people saw that Moses delayed to come down from the mountain, the people assembled about Aaron and said to him, okay, and again, it's these people that they're saying are maybe Jannes and Jambres, okay? Come, make us a god who will go before us. As for this Moses, the man who brought us up from the land of Egypt, we do not know what has become of him. Aaron said to them, tear off the gold rings which are in your ears of your wives, your sons, and your daughters, and bring them to me. And all the people tore off the gold rings which were in their ears and brought them to Aaron. He took this from their hands and fashioned it with a graving tool and made it into a molten calf. And they said, this is your God, O Israel, who brought you up from the land of Egypt. Now when Aaron saw this, he built an altar before it. And Aaron made a proclamation and said, tomorrow shall be a feast to the Lord. So the next day they rose early and offered burnt offerings and brought peace offerings. And the people sat down to eat and to drink and rose up to play. A little later on it says, it came about as soon as Moses came near the camp that he saw the calf and the dancing. And Moses' anger burned, and he threw the tablets from his hands and shattered them at the foot of the mountain. He took the calf which they had made and burned it with fire and ground it into powder and scattered it over the surface of the water and made the sons of Israel drink. Now, this passage, it actually goes on, and Moses, he goes to his brother Aaron and he questions him. And eventually, the story, it concludes with many people dying. And it all is because of the initial rebellion of these potential people, Jannes and Jambres. Think about how sad and how awful that this whole picture is. They've seen God do incredible things. And yet, the moment that Moses, while the cat's away, the mice will play. The moment he's away, they go, well, he's probably gone forever. Let's now take off all of our gold jewelry and make a calf. Really? Crazy. I just got to say, sometimes our choice to sin, it gravely impacts other people. And it was a slippery slope. But this is the true story, and these are the people, regardless, their choice, it was a slippery slope. So now the why. Here is why it's important. Here is the whole point to it. Although we don't know for 100% who Jannes and Jambres were, this is what we do know. They are people that represent people who opposed God and God's leader at that time, Moses. Jannes and Jambres are these real representations of people all throughout history who have been opponents to God's work. They have sometimes in subtle ways crept in. And perhaps they are just tricky in their nature. They perhaps are people who can initially identify themselves as even a believer. But in reality, they're wolves in sheep's clothing. We've been kind of hinting and going back and circling for the last few weeks about the parable of the wheat and the tares, which occurs in Matthew 13. And this is really, again, it harkens back to that whole concept that Jesus shares. You got to see it. At the harvest, when this wheat and the tares, they're both ready to be harvested, it is at that point that they're going to be easy and able to be identified. Until then, sometimes it's a little bit tricky. It's hard to kind of get to it. I want you to listen. I think the way John Piper summarizes this entire passage, it's profound. This is what he says. The good news is in verse 9. They will not make further progress, for their folly will be obvious to all. Paul is saying that Jannes and Jambres in every age pose a very real threat, but have a very real, God-ordained limit. In the last days, things will get progressively worse. God has promised that. They will get worse not merely because of natural disasters, even though those will intensify. They will get worse primarily because of the people who populate these last days. Among the people populating the last days will be a group who profess to be believers, but in fact are impersonators. Out of that group, there will be a subset of impostors who will occupy pulpits, but have no power. But young men, do not get upset, because ultimately their folly will be exposed. The bottom line is God is in control. The good news is that God is not worried about it, and never should you be. So what? Today's passage, it's really a part 2 of what we looked at last week. It's really kind of this continuation of this story, where now you have this example laid out of this type of people that you see in every age, but it's going to be intensified. These Jannes and Jambres type people. Remember, take courage. God is in control. Even if it looks, as you look outside and things seem to spiral with chaos, you have to realize God is in control. God knows every last aspect of it, and God, in His perfect timing, He is going to expose it. We need to simply be grounded in the truth and guard against that strange teaching. That doesn't mean that I know every bit of the strange teaching that is out there. Sometimes we get sidetracked and it's like, well, I don't know all of the variables of the strange teaching. No. You just need to know the truth. Be grounded in the truth of God's Word. That will help you identify the counterfeits. All right? I have an example. This is a real, genuine $20 bill. For my time at Walmart, I learned a few things, but one thing that I learned is as a cashier, when you are given money, they do not know every version of every counterfeit that is out there. What they focus on, and the bank tellers do the same thing, they focus on the genuine, the real McCoy. They're looking right here at this $20 bill, and they're going to find all the nuances that they know of this to be a true, genuine $20 bill. So when something false comes along, it doesn't match up to the truth. And they're able to go, that right there is a counterfeit, because it's not the truth. So that's what they do. Okay? Think about that with us. Think about that with us. When we come to other things, we should be so well versed in God's Word, be grounded in the truth, that is going to be something that we are easily able to spot those counterfeits. Those things that maybe sometimes come in sneakily. They come in this creepy type of way. We should know, we should be able to go, no, that doesn't match this. This right here is the foundation to all things. The way that we view our interactions with the world, the way that we view everything that happens, the teachings, it needs to be through the lenses of God's Word. It's got to all come back to here, the real, genuine McCoy, the real truth. We cross-check. So that being said, today's challenge, my desire and my prayer for everyone here, myself included, is to saturate yourself with God's Word. Just like that sponge last week, just absolutely absorb it. Have it spilling out all over the place, but know God's Word for yourself. And that will allow you to be guarded against being one of those maybe women that were gullible, or just people that are gullible and carried away by these Jannes and Jambres type people, these people that are just counterfeits. Focus our eyes on the unchanging reality of who God is and really dwell, especially this Thanksgiving season, over what God has done for us on our personal behalf. And let that be something that guides you this week in your interactions with family, with friends, with just general population. Let that be something that we're absorbing, that we're just soaking ourselves in. Let's pray. Dear Lord, I thank you that you have given us the compass, Lord, the way that points to the truth, your word. Lord, I thank you that that is the genuine, real deal. Lord, that we can go to it, that we can center ourselves in it. Lord, I pray as we read it this week, Lord, I pray as we just pour ourselves into it, Lord, that it impacts us. That it's not just for an intellectual gain, Lord, but it is just a practical, applicational life change. Lord, I've noticed that that is really what happens in the Bible. When people came in contact with you, life changes. They're no longer the same. That's the same with me, Lord. When I came in contact with that moment, Lord, where I knew you to be the Lord, the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords, Lord, and I surrendered myself. Lord, I gave everything over into your hands. Lord, you just did a work. You continue to do a work. And I am so grateful for that, Lord, that you're not done with me. Lord, I'm thankful that this is not the finished product. Lord, I thank you that you love me enough to continue to just push me to your word. Lord, that you continue to just fine-tune and knock off those chips that are there. Lord, help me to be more Christ-like. Lord, help me as I interact with other people. Lord, help me to have wisdom to be able to direct things back to your word. That unchanging truth that no counterfeit can do anything to. I love the fact in that story of the Egyptians, Lord, that it got to the point that they just couldn't. They could not duplicate it. Lord, that's reality. No matter what the counterfeits are, Lord, there comes a time where they just can't duplicate you. It all falls short because you are so superior. Lord, let's never forget that. Let us bask in that this week, Lord, especially over the Thanksgiving time. We love you, and we pray this in your precious name.